Hello, and thank you for joining our exclusive event today featuring EmployBridge's Vice President, Kathy Canfield, to talk through the results of our 2022 Voice of the Blue Collar Worker Survey. This is a large webinar, which means all attendees are muted. However, we love to hear from you, so throughout our time together, please feel free to type any questions you have in the Q&A section. As time allows in the hour we're scheduled to be together, Kathy may have the opportunity to respond to a few questions live today. Again, thank you for joining us. In 2007, we launched what is now called the Voice of the Blue Collar Worker Survey, which is the largest of its kind in the country. The survey captures the work-related priorities and preferences of thousands of hourly workers in the supply chain. Today's host, Kathy Canfield, is the Vice President of Brand Solutions and Marketing at EmployBridge and an 18-year veteran of the staffing industry. Kathy's focused on innovative solutions for clients and industry-specific thought leadership with each of the company's brands. She actively pursues new ways to do work in order to positively impact the client, associate, and colleague experience. She also speaks at national and local industry events on the topic of labor. So without further ado, welcome, Kathy.
Thanks so much, Brian, and welcome everyone to our webinar. So excited to have you here. I apologize for my voice. Spring allergies have hit our house, and so you get sort of a tough voice here this morning, but thanks again for joining, and we're going to hop right in here. As Brian shared, there will be several polls throughout the presentation, as well as feel free to offer up any questions or chat along the way, and we'll do our best to help support that. So as Brian shared, if you aren't familiar with our survey, it's the largest and longest running survey of the U.S. hourly blue collar workforce in the country. It's our 16th year, and this year we had 19,491 respondents. So we're super excited about having that far reach nationally with our hourly workers. They answered anonymously through multiple choice and free response questions. And the participants included hourly workers in transportation, logistics, and manufacturing. Today, we're going to take a look at the big picture of the labor market and use some of our labor stats from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to tell us a little bit more about what's happening here in real time. And then finally, we'll share what our blue collar workers told us about their work experience and priorities, and then insights to help you navigate what continues to be an historically tight job market. So first, as you know, the first Friday of every month, the BLS releases job numbers. And the reality of the ride we've all been on through the pandemic is clear from the data shown here. We're near recovery to pre-pandemic employment levels as of April. And it's, of course, dramatically faster than we saw during the Great Recession in 2008. And so economists are sort of worried about this rapid return because, of course, it took us, a decade to add around 23 million jobs back to the workforce after our earlier recession. And when COVID hit, you'll see in just 2 years, we've almost completely recovered at least to pre-pandemic levels. And so while this is really exciting for some, for those of us watching inflation and potential recession scenarios, this is a little bit of a concern, right? So this will be something we continue to watch for you. And if you're interested in continuing to see what this looks like, certainly don't hesitate to reach out to your representative, and they'd be able to supply you with updated information that you're going to see here on the next few slides. The next topic that we like to always cover is around workforce participation. And this is so important, right? Because as we're looking to do everything we can to find the best talent for our organizations, one of the factors is how can we motivate folks who have chosen, at least to this point, to not participate in the workplace at all. And so you can see this is a continual concern since 2020, when we went through the pandemic. The folks just aren't returning back to those regular rates. And so the 62% participation rate is staying relatively flat, which isn't good news for us. And so we'll continue to monitor this. The reality is, though, that we have about 2 jobs for every person available for work. And so there's just this tremendous demand for workers to be back in the workforce, but we're not seeing them jump back in as they had done historically. And so, we're going to talk here a little bit about the generational gap too, but we have a lot of older folks, obviously, who are beginning to retire and some younger folks entering the workforce. And they just have a different view of what that workplace should look like moving forward. So let's dive into that a little bit on the next slide. So here's the shifting generations that are happening here. And so I'd like to draw your attention to the line 65 to 74-year-olds, right? This is our baby boomer generation that are starting to retire. And there's going to be, about 4 million of these folks retiring here over the next few years. And so what do we need to do about that, right? And how do we need to adjust accordingly to be prepared? And so we know millennials are now the largest generation in the workforce, are key decision makers in many places and sort of coming up through the ranks. And we know that they're bringing with them sort of a change in their view of the social contract between an employer and an employee. And so they're looking at things very differently. And so is the Gen Z generation behind them, right? And so the key that I want you to pay attention to here is this group that's 16 to 24. Not only are they not replacing our baby boomers who are retiring, but there are less of them. And so we have this tremendous gap, right, between our boomers and our Gen Z. And so we have to adjust for that. And that's why we started with a poll question around robotics and automation and what's happening in your facility today, because sometimes you see in some national news outlets that, there's a concern about robotics and automation and sort of taking jobs away. And when we look at, data like this, we say, hey, there's a need for robotics and automation in smart ways, right? Because we actually will need them to support the work that you're trying to get out the door. And the jobs will look differently, but it won't necessarily be a negative scenario to be talking about less jobs, because frankly, there will just be less people, and so we have to be prepared to handle this sort of population loss that you see here. So super important to understand this and continue to monitor this over time. This is the projection through 2029. So this gives you a sense here, at least through the end of the decade. So we've talked a little bit about supply, and now we'd like to share a little bit with you about demand. And one of the ways we monitor demand is to take a look at job postings. Particularly, we use Indeed. In this case, this is coming from Indeed. And this is sort of a 4-year trend around production and manufacturing jobs. And you'll see, in 2019, which was a typical year, you can see that the black line shows about 170,000 manufacturing jobs. And it's common, of course, in manufacturing to see a slight dip here. So you'll see in November and December with some closings. But the light blue line shows the number of job postings in 2020. We started off as normal. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and companies started pulling their job postings. And so when everyone was trying to figure out, am I an essential employer? What does that mean? And as soon as I started to reclassify or rework what was happening in my facility, you started to see those job postings go up significantly. Now, when you look at the yellow line in 2021, we think it could be a little bit misleading for us, because we've all heard about the Great Resignation, where workers are leaving jobs at unprecedented levels. So in addition to advertising for new jobs that have been created recently, companies also had to advertise for replacements for the workers who had resigned, right? So we just had this massive uptick. And so in 2022, you see this dark line, right? It's sort of picking up where 2021 left off. And as we talked about, looking at the economy in general, this is sort of a concern. If you're listening to any commentary around inflation right now, they're sort of hoping that some of these job openings will actually soften a little bit. And so you see some flattening out here because we've been growing at such a rapid pace. And you can see such a big move. I mean, 142% increase over January 2020, a 77% increase over 21. So this is something to watch. Just be very aware. You already feel this day to day that you're competing for these workers, but this just gives you a visual of how different the landscape is here over the past few years. And then let's take a look at distribution. We have some loading and stocking job postings, a little bit different story, but you're still fighting for the best talent. People working in distribution centers and e-fulfillment centers like Amazon and Walmart.com. You can see these big swings in the Q3 and Q4. That's sort of natural for this space. But please keep in mind, just prior to the pandemic in 2020, it was already difficult enough to find and fill all the openings that we had in warehouse positions. And now those openings are almost 3 times the number that we were looking for even pre-pandemic. And so we know you're tired trying to find great people to fill your spots. And so again, maybe not quite the growth that we've seen in some of the manufacturing, but you're still feeling it. But you see, again, it's starting to soften up just a little bit here compared to last year. And so as we figure out, supply chain issues and that kind of thing, we predict that it may stay pretty flat and maybe just come down a little bit here in the coming months. So we'll keep track of that for you, but just wanted you to be aware of where things stand. And then I think we'll go to slide 9, but I'm hoping we can do another poll before we jump into this topic. All right. Have you recently increased pay for hourly workers? And if so, what's been the time frame? All right. Yep, we are going to share the responses. So whenever you're ready. All right, here we go. So almost 40% of you have increased wages in the last 12 months, and then 28 and 26 for 6 and 3, so pretty equal there. And then some of you haven't raised rates at all, which means I'm sure that your pay rates were awesome already. So that's good. This just gives you a sense, guys, in the group here, and why I even brought this up at all is because one of the favorite indicators we look at for pay rate is our consumer price index. And you'll see here that, it's taken a really long time for our associates to sort of have a fighting chance related to their labor costs. And if you're not familiar with this chart, go ahead and take a look at the red line. So you can see their wages were stagnant for about 12 years from 2002 to 2014. And these workers were falling further and further behind economically. And the gap between the consumer price index and the average wages hit its peak in 2013, when it was almost 4 years into the recovery from the Great Recession. And so what this is showing you guys is that that blue line is showing that how much it costs for basic needs, think groceries, basic staples that all of us may need to run a household. And then what we were paying as EmployBridge, okay, our average wages for our associates in our system. And so you see just this massive gap. And so, that always was a concern of ours. And so since then, the continued demand for labor has driven up pay rates, right? It's as simple as economics 101. When demand increases and supply decreases or remains the same, prices go up. And in this case, prices are pay rates for us. It's important to note that even with a dramatic increase in wages in the past 4 to 5 years, the average worker is just slightly ahead of where they were financially in 2002. And by the way, we were not overpaying workers in 2002. They were not taking big vacations and contributing to stock portfolios, right? They were barely getting by. And so during the previous decade, companies got used to not having to increase pay rates for years and years. And now, of course, you're increasing pay rates much more regularly. And so it's simply something that we're not used to having to do. And that's why we have to continue to have discussions that are data driven around pay rate, because arguably, and I think you'll see in our Voice of the Blue Collar Worker results, associates' lives have changed during the pandemic, right? They're making more money in some cases than they've ever made before, thanks to you and the pay rate adjustments that you've made in the last couple of years. But with some of this inflationary pressure, it's really chipping away at that pay rate growth that they're experiencing, right? And so as employers, we're going to have to watch that relationship to make sure that associates sort of stay on the upside, that it's fair and realistic, but that they're able to take care of their basic needs. And so this is something we update every month. We watch this very closely to understand what the market conditions are for associates. And so if you're interested in having us do some analysis on pay rates, we're happy to help you work through that. And so we'll continue to monitor this. Right now, we've had this tremendous pay rate growth that you guys have been a part of. I think this will start to flatten a little bit, but absolutely, you're still competing. If you want to compete for the best, you're still going to have to be competitive in this space. Okay, so let's jump to the Voice of the Blue Collar Worker results for this year. For those of you who've been partnering with us for years and years and years, you may have looked at things that are, a decade old. You've been trending this data with us. And so we actually have some really unique things that have happened this year that are a little different than we've seen in years past. So excited to jump in. So first of all, let's just take a look at some major themes. Number one, pay rates continue to drive job choices as well as other aspects of total comp, which we'll get into some details here in the next few slides. Number two, while shift and flexibility, of course, have always been important, now they're among the top 3 factors in a worker's decision about the jobs they choose and whether or not they're going to stay. The theme 3 is, of course, despite a crazy year with a bunch of things going on in our world, workers are pretty optimistic about their financial future, and they're telling us they're satisfied with their current roles, which we have not seen in the past. And so this is sort of exciting, and we'll talk a little bit, unpack that a little bit. And then 4, COVID, the concerns have lessened significantly for most of the population, but our female workers are still pretty concerned about COVID and what that means at the workplace and what it means for their families. And so if you employ a large female population, you're going to want to pay attention to what they're thinking about this so that you can help calm fears at the workplace. And before we talk about slide 12, can we put up a quick poll question here? So how often do you typically provide a pay increase to hourly workers? All right, we can show the results whenever you're ready. Okay, interesting. So 68% of you are providing an increase every year, and then based upon performance, and then new skills, and then every 6 months. I asked this question because we asked our associates how often they expected a pay increase, and 41% of them said based upon performance, attendance, and quality. So they want a pay increase, but are more than happy to earn that. So something to just keep in mind. And then 28% said every year, and 25% said every 6 months. So just to give you a quick view of that. And so let's jump into Voice of the Blue Collar results. So again, we have been asking this question since the beginning of the survey in 2007. What is most important to you when looking for a job? And pay rate has always been number 1. And so this year it's at 39%, which you'll see to the right is actually a 7% increase over last year. And so this is interesting because for some of you, you've given the largest increases to this group that you've done maybe ever in the history of your company. And so even with that, there is still incredible pay rate pressure for you to compete to find the best workers in your area. And so, if you haven't looked at pay rates in a while, or, you want to be creative about, hey, I can't do pay rates across the board, but I can do it for these groups, I would highly encourage you to take a look at that. Following, 2, 3, 4, job security, schedule and shift, enjoy the work, have been about the same since last year. And you'll see COVID is starting to drop there, right? So as we talked about, we're starting to see that slow down a little bit. In the next slide, we're going to talk about places they've worked in the past. And so this question was, ask them to think about the places they've worked recently and what are the top 3 reasons you worked there. And this starts us telling us a lot about what's on their mind. And you'll see here, schedule is now 21% in this space, which it's never been number 1 here. And so again, if you don't have the strongest pay rates in your space, you're really going to have to think about schedule and doing everything you can to lure associates or employees away from your neighbors. And the one way to do that is to have a really nice schedule set up for them to come take a look. Of course, they're still interested in consistent pay increases, good company culture, and good benefits. And then, of course, location. So if you guys, the tougher it is for an associate or an employee to get to you, all these other factors are magnified because you're asking them to sort of go above and beyond. Some of them don't have reliable transportation, or they're using bus systems and that kind of thing. So being aware of what you're asking these hourly workers to do is incredibly important. All right, let's go to retention. So the first few slides have been about attracting the right talent. And now we're going to move into once I get them, how do I keep them? And this is a really big shift, guys, from last year. So last year, when we asked the question, other than pay increases, what can companies do to earn your loyalty? Last year, 3 of the 5 were sort of like softer responses, right? Care about my growth, the culture and the values, and they respect me, and they understand I have obligations outside of work, right? And so that was great. And that was very interesting for what was going on in their lives. But we had a really sharp shift. This year, advancement opportunity was number 1. So now I think that they've had a taste of these pay increases and they understand that there's more opportunity and there's all these jobs out there available for them to choose. They're like, what's next for me? What are my opportunities ahead at this location? How can I continue to advance? Again, here comes schedule. And we're going to talk a lot about schedule here in the next slide, but they're looking for some flexibility. Gone are the days where they're just going to automatically commit to the normal schedule because stuff's going on at home, right? A lot of these folks are educating their children still in remote classroom type environments. They're caring for, extended family who either have had COVID or at a high risk for COVID. And so we think, there's a mindset shift happening, and COVID has sort of readjusted how these guys view work. And so they're really taking a look at some things differently. The next 2 here, we've never seen in the top 5 in our survey, providing 401k and providing some type of insurance contribution. Again, we think it probably has to do with the pay rate adjustments that we've seen over the past couple of years. Now that they've crested the consumer price index and they can cover some of their basic needs, now they're shifting to, okay, how do I start to save? And guys, these aren't folks who want to save, $100 every paycheck or something like that. They're looking for easy entry points, right? Like $5 a paycheck. Right. So they're not working through, big sums of money. They're just looking for an entry point that allows them to start their savings journey. And so, again, I don't think it necessarily has to be a big lift on us as employers, but just to be aware these are the types of things they're looking for so that we can figure out ways to bring programs to them. All right, so let's talk about this. Let's unpack this schedule situation, because I know for many of you, there's a lot of heartburn, right? You may be in a manufacturing facility that has to run, 24/7 because of your process, for example. And so like, how do we start to work through some of that? So let's take a look. This has always been the case. Of course, there's a huge majority of folks who prefer first shift. So this year it was 70%. But you see the second shift and third shift are sitting in there at 16 and 12. But for those of you who have weekend shifts, they're very, very slim pickings, right? So if you're talking to 100 people about an opportunity, only 2 of them prefer a weekend shift. And so just going in, knowing that I've got a weekend shift to cover, that's going to take maximum creativity on your part to bring those people in. And they're going to have to be treated, in a special way to get them to not only be there, but be there consistently and on time, right? And then let's look at shift structure to the right. So for the first year, we actually started separating some of this information out by gender. And so this will be important for you, again, depending upon who you have out on the floor. And so you see the 5 8-hour shifts, of course, are the most popular, but even more so for your female population. Of course, usually it's because they have family obligations, right? They can get someone maybe to drop off the kiddos, but they need to be there to pick up, or they may do the drop off, but they need to, or they can do the drop off, but they're just looking for help on either end of that shift. And so just be aware that if you're trying to lure a large female population, they're going to naturally go toward that 8-hour shift if they can get it. For the guys, they prefer the 10-hour and 12-hour, if comparison to their female counterparts. If those are the only options in their space, they seem to be picking those up with no problem. And then you see these concepts of flex and gig here. And I share these just so you can start to get a sense of sort of what's happening, right? We're starting to see this flex scenario take on sort of a life of its own. And we would expect to see this grow in the coming years. And when we say flex, this is what we mean. We mean that you keep your current shift times, so there's no change in your shift, but instead of expecting one person to fill that job, we actually split that up between 2 or 3 people. So if you have a 5 8-hour shift, you may have one person who commits to Monday and Tuesday of every week, and then another person who commits to Wednesday, and then another person who commits to Thursday and Friday. Again, not optimal necessarily for your supervisors, but if they're coming more often and they're reliable workers and good workers, instead of missing them altogether because they can't work for you for the full 40 hours, we're seeing them absolutely want to commit to you for a shorter period of time and be incredibly reliable. And so if that's an option in your space, we would definitely encourage you to consider it. It's also a great way to cover some gaps in your traditional attendance scenarios where you can bring these folks in to help cover. And gig, if you haven't dabbled in this space yet, again, it's not for all locations, but this is something to absolutely consider. And we're actually working on a solution ourselves to bring to you. And this idea is actually that you're unbundling a shift. And so if you have a traditional 8-hour shift, you would break that up into 4-hour gigs and then schedule accordingly. And so we're finding that this gig worker is actually open to work in warehousing and manufacturing. And so where it makes sense, this is sort of a brand new labor pool. And we're having success in early pilots around the country. And so if that's something that's of interest to you, you'd like to learn more about our research and what we've been learning, we're happy to share that with you. All right. We have one more slide about shift here, and that's around not only preferred schedules and shifts, but what it would take to have someone change from first shift. And so this is the question we ask: what is the minimum amount of pay increase per hour you would require to work a shift other than first shift and then stay on that shift. And so this is a big deal, right? We see a lot of folks who are willing to try out second shift or try out the weekend shift, but we tend to have a bunch of turnover or really poor attendance. And so this is important for you all if you're really trying to fill those off shifts. If someone prefers first, to get them to move, you're now looking at a $2 an hour shift differential. Of course, we've never seen this before. You can see it's 50-cent increase just from last year alone. And so what that tells us, right, is once these folks find their shift and they like the work, they're staying there. They're not moving for 50 cents here or 75 cents here, unless there's, other stuff going on, whether it's a culture fit or something like that. But if they like their current environment and their shift, they're not considering another opportunity unless there's big money at the end. And so this, again, just an awareness of sort of what you're fighting out there. If you're trying to recruit folks on off shifts, if they prefer first, it's going to be a battle because they're really looking for a lot more money than they were even last year. Okay, and like I said in my preliminary comments, as we move to the next slide, there's a lot of optimism out there. And we haven't asked about this before, and we asked this year because we were curious just about the mindset. How are people feeling? Like we're coming out of some, COVID mask restrictions, that kind of thing. How's everybody doing? And so when we asked them about their financial future, I mean, look at this, extremely optimistic. Over a third of them, very optimistic, 30%. So these guys are walking around, I'm pretty sure footing, again, largely in part because of you and the moves you made to get pay rates adjusted, above CPI. They're holding, they look like they're thinking about their future and they're pretty excited about where it's going. And we can see that again in the job satisfaction scenario. So in their current job, how satisfied are you? And you've got somewhat satisfied, again, a third, but then very and extremely satisfied follow right behind that. And so again, pretty strong. If they've found a job and they're paid well, they're pretty satisfied in that spot. Now, I will say this, we also asked the question about how are you currently looking for work? And so, yes, they're indicating that they're satisfied in their current job, but we've also seen an increase of folks who may not be actively looking, but they would absolutely consider another opportunity if it came to them. And so this is where sort of your recruiting and creative recruiting back and forth between your competitors, in your industrial park or in your community. If you have something unique to offer associates and you have competitive pay rates, you may be able to get a really strong worker who's willing to take that jump, but don't assume because they're satisfied that they won't jump for another opportunity. So, but overall, we're super happy to see this and to see that associates are adjusting pretty well to the new normal. All right, and then this is always one of my favorite ones to show because sometimes pay increases aren't possible, right? Or aren't possible without, letters to Congress and everything else because you're within your structures and your workplaces. It may be just really a hard lift to take a look at pay increases. And so, one of the options is always to take a look at an offering like a PTO offering. And so we did the basic math here for you. If you were to offer 5 days of PTO, versus the dollar increase for a year, you can see, there's really substantial savings to offer the PTO over the dollar per hour increase. And look at what our associates are telling you. If they got to choose, they would choose their current pay with 5 days of PTO 82% of the time, which, guys, this is an 11% increase over last year. So these guys are really motivated for a PTO offering. And it's interesting when you couple that with another question we asked, which is why or what what best fits the reason you left your last job. And the number one answer was, I felt overworked and burnt out. And so if you are in a scenario right now where you're working folks their normal shift, and then you're have a mandatory overtime scenario or something like that, these guys are tired, and you need to be careful, because these are the folks who may really like working at your location, but they can't handle the pace, right? And all the days of work. And so I encourage some of our customers to even, hey, you don't have to go all the way to 5 days. This is an opportunity for you to be creative around flexibility. Hey, after a certain, 60 days of work, you get a 4-hour chunk of time to take care of doctor's appointments and family care and childcare, and all these different things that come up in their lives. And so many of us are blessed to have PTO to go handle some of those things. In many cases, some of these hourly workers don't have that luxury, and or not enough of it because of the things they're working on at home. So definitely consider something like this. And also remember, as I was talking about COVID and sort of the general sentiment of our workers, we asked them how they were feeling about COVID. And we have sort of a 50-50 split. 50% are like, COVID what? I don't remember COVID, right? I'm good. And then we have the other half who's like, yeah, I'm still pretty concerned about this. And their number one reason for concern, guys, was their family's health. And so I think we have a lot of folks taking care of, maybe it's elderly parents, or, a family member who's at a higher risk. And so even though they're there every day and they're doing their job, it doesn't mean they're not worried. And so just be aware that these folks are carrying that burden with them to work. And our female workers, even more so. Maybe 8% or so more females than males are worried about COVID. And, as far as the question of like, is, COVID still, impacting our workplaces? For sure it is. When we asked about their last 3 absences and their reason for their last 3 absences, COVID-19 was their number one answer. And so even on the absence side of the equation, COVID is absolutely still impacting this workforce in a big way. All right, so let's jump into some recommendations here. First, if you haven't heard me so far, shift and schedule continue to be a big priority for our workers. Please consider looking at part-time or flexible shifts for current workers, or come up with a cool shift to attract a different group of people, students or parents or second jobbers. We're seeing a lot of creativity out there from your colleagues saying, hey, I'm going to do a parent shift from 9 to 2, and we're going to figure out, how to make that work so that we can tap into these awesome workers who are incredibly reliable, but they need to make sure they can do drop off and pick up for their kiddos. So if you haven't started that conversation at your location, just start to have conversations about what that could look like in your space. Number 2, this recommendation always used to say competitive pay rate, but now we've changed that to competitive compensation, because we're seeing both savings and healthcare contributions starting to come into the top 5 for associates. And again, it's because they've felt that pay rate jump, and they're feeling more positive about where they are financially. And so now they're sort of pivoting and getting into scenarios around savings and that kind of thing. I hope that positivity holds, but of course, if we head into inflation or recessionary scenarios, some of that gain that our associates have seen may start to wane, right? So we'll have to watch that closely. The third one, just be aware and continue to educate yourselves about these workers. They do look at the world a little bit differently. They have different sets of obligations and how they choose to go about things. So, take this information, share it with your leaders, share it with your supervisors, and get folks super comfortable with not just, I think, or anecdotal information about this worker group, but this factual information about what they shared with us that is most important to them. And I think if we will meet them halfway, they will more than make up and be incredibly loyal for you all, taking a moment to say, hey, we've heard you, and we're going to make these adjustments based upon what you've shared with us. And then our fourth recommendation is around compassion and respect, and demonstrating both toward these workers, both personally and professionally. And we used to say here, demonstrate empathy and respect. And for those of you who are familiar with the book Radical Candor, they sort of challenge the use of the word empathy alone. And they actually say, hey, you should be taking a look at compassion, because compassion is empathy plus action. And that really, for someone who's been working with our associates for many years, that really drove the point home that if we're empathetic, like we're only halfway there. We have to sort of understand the situation they're in and then do something about it, right? And so I would ask for you to do just that. Have compassion and respect for these workers, and then take action to do whatever we can to lure them back to the workplace and be that great employer for them. Radical Candor. I saw someone. There you go. Thank you, everyone. And then recommendation number 5. We used to have just have really good onboarding, but as you saw, like the opportunity for advancement is number 1 now. And so I think you not only have to have strong onboarding experience for new hires, but you have to really talk openly about what career advancement looks like at your facility, and point to some great examples of folks like, hey, when he started with us, he was over here and now he does this, right? And making it very real for them that, hey, I can have a very long career here that allows me to move up financially, but also in title and responsibility. There's a certain segment of this hourly workforce that is very, very interested and focused on that right now. And so if you're not talking about that early and often, we think you're missing a chance to keep these folks close. And then finally, attendance policies and mandatory overtime are really tough, and they're going to continue to be tough as we move into more Gen Z workers. Guys, these folks just do not agree with, I'm going to spend my life at work. They're very focused on work-life balance. And if they have family obligations, they are going to go there first and work will be second. And so making sure that attendance policies are realistic, and that we're doing everything we can to try to reduce as much mandatory overtime as possible with either a flex shift or some type of gig shift or something like that. It's going to be incredibly important, because if we don't get creative in this space, these folks are just not going to come to work as we'd like, and then we're all in trouble, right? So I see several of you sort of sharing best practices back and forth. It's amazing. And that's one of the purposes we hoped from this webinar, is you guys could maybe meet and greet with some people along the way. But I can tell you, there are a lot of colleagues out there in your space who are doing amazing things. And so please network and get to know your peers, because they're having really strong success. And we're not saying, hey, you've got to do all 6 of these things tomorrow. We just need you to make progress, take one step forward, right, on one of them. And then, over time, you can start to tackle more and more. But if you don't take any action at all, then my fear is you'll be left sort of holding the bag here. So let's move to our final slide, Ryan. Oh, sorry. Yeah, perfect. So again, at the end of the day, why do we even do this? Right? It's a lot of work, to track down our associates and ask them to tell us what they think. But we think listening to them and amplifying their voice is so important. They're vital to our economy. And if we can provide data and insights and facts that allow you to attract and motivate and retain these workers, we think we're doing a good thing. Right? We also want to provide reliable information and sort of non-emotional analysis to advise you, our customers, on workforce practices, and do everything we can to help you be as competitive as possible in the market. And then finally, we want to share this with as many people as possible. And so we'll make sure that you have access to a lot of this information because, we know you care about these workers, and we want to do everything we can to continue to study their mindset and most importantly, keep them working for you and for us. And so let's move to the next slide. We do have a site where you can go get a lot of this information that we've covered today. And again, feel free to share it with your teams and with other leaders. But that's why it's here. It's here to help make us all better. And, just make sure that these folks who you're employing at this hourly level understand that we recognize we can't do our jobs without them, right? And we appreciate them so much. And so let's take a few minutes to see maybe if there are any questions that may be good for the overall group here. But I really appreciate your time today, guys. And hopefully this information is insightful. And we're really looking forward to continuing the conversation. If you think that it could be helpful for this information to be shared with a larger leadership team at a location or at a regional meeting or something like that, don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to come and talk to your team and see what we can do to continue the conversation around these associates. Brian, anything you see? You may not be able to see it, actually. I may be able to see it better.
I can see it. I'm just the participation in the chat is phenomenal. So
it's
thank you all
awesome. Exactly.
for being so engaged in sharing your ideas. I found one on the partial shift idea. Does that contain benefits if it's part-time? Is that without benefits?
I see. Yeah. So that's a great question. That'll all depend upon your policies, of course. And then, of course, there are a lot of different regulations at the federal level and state level. So yes, it really depends upon the structure. Of course, for us as a labor provider, we have a little bit more flexibility than you as full-time employers. So definitely encourage you to take a look at what can work in your locale. But like I said, when we've taken a look at the flex shifts, we've seen usually 2 to 3 people having to fill that one FTE shift, right? So some people will work 2 days and then another person will work 3. But in some cases, we've had to split that up into 3 people to cover your traditional shift. So, but usually it's sitting in that part-time capacity for sure.
Got it. Thank you, Kathy. Another one. How much is pay a part of advancement opportunities? Was that?
It's a great question. We don't specifically ask for that, although I think we could assume that when they're talking about advancement, they're also looking for pay. However, I can tell you in a lot of the interview work that we've done with associates, a lot of these guys don't expect much, to be honest. They're coming from tough environments in some cases, or where things haven't gone, perfectly in their lives. And so for some of these folks, they're just excited to be recognized, period. Recognized for perfect attendance, recognized for hitting production numbers. And so advancement opportunity could mean just, a better shift that they're interested in, or, hey, I want to be considered to take this class or be trained in this discipline. And so I think it's right to ask the question and to see, and maybe poll your own workforce, hey, as you look at advancement opportunities, what things are most important to you? And I think you'll be super thrilled with how they look at that. I don't think money is always the number one factor there.
Thank you, Kathy. I have another question. We're a manufacturing company primarily servicing the automotive industry, which is extremely volatile. How can we help workers understand that our customers also change schedules, production needs, which require us to do some overtime to simply meet schedules? We have also improved our flexibility, but it is a two-way street. Sometimes we just need the extra hours worked.
Yeah, I think it's a great call out. I mean, life still continues to happen to us sometimes. And I think you're right. I think it's hard sometimes for an hourly worker to understand that you guys don't have it all figured out. and that you're dependent upon suppliers up the line to deliver on the things they've promised to obviously make it all work at your facility. And so I think number one, that education and that transparency is incredibly important. These folks sometimes don't get the benefit of the why. They're not ever told exactly how it all works. And so, when we say, hey, we need to send everyone home, or hey, we need you all to stay an extra 3 hours, like, how did that happen? Like, how could that possibly happen? Don't you guys plan for this? It's like, oh yeah, like we need to, explain to you how this works. And so don't be afraid to tell them the truth, and be like, hey guys, like this is going to be a really tough few weeks or months. And here's why. Here's the supply chain, and this is how it works. And these are all the things that affect our ability, and so I would encourage huge transparency. And then you're right. I think allowing, though, in some cases for folks who say, hey, when I committed to this job, I committed to, 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. And so when you ask me to work past that, I can't. Like, I've got a family and I have obligations when I get home. And so figuring out a way to work through what they can and can't do is also important. Like, we've seen some associates quit a job and never have that conversation with their supervisor. And when we go back to the supervisor, it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't know. And if they can't work every day late, can I get them to commit to get out their family obligations set up where they can be with me on Monday, Tuesday at least? And so I think if you're going to keep folks in some type of OT because there's so much volatility in your space, then figure out if there are flexibility points and where those are, and then talk to your people about that and give them the chance to meet you halfway versus assuming that they won't, and just sort of keeping them in the dark. So it's absolutely real. And I think the more we include them in those conversations, the better off we both are.
Thank you, Kathy. Have you seen an increase in companies offering flexible benefit packages to employees where the employee can choose between either more pay or less benefits or vice versa?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't have any firsthand knowledge on that. So those of you who are still here and chatting, if you guys have some scenarios about that, that would be interesting. And I know, based upon associates in general and just their general interest in taking a look at options, I think it's absolutely a really good idea to consider, but I don't have any firsthand knowledge about those offerings, but it's a great idea.
Got it. Is anyone at EmployBridge tracking the cost or time spent training gig workers on a daily basis? It's a real expense that, and one that needs to be factored in when considering bringing on a new person every day.
Yeah, so we actually track it a lot. And what we're finding is the gig worker pool is actually quite stable. So yes, of course, at the beginning, there is additional training, although I'll say we've seen it work best when there's little training at all. So think to yourself that you could get someone up to speed like within that a 4-hour gig, right? So this would be, sort of that entry level role is where we see that working best. But once they're there, yes, they may only, show up for 4 gigs a week, for example, on average, but we're finding them to be much more reliable. We're seeing over 95% attendance rates, which is of course amazing. Where, they're coming in and actually being more productive than our traditional 8-hour or 10-hour worker. And so while yes, there is sort of some training on the front end that we need to be aware of. Actually, on the back end, we're seeing some huge benefits, including injury reduction, right? Because a lot of injuries we see are in the second half of the shift, because most of these folks are not working a second part of a shift. They're actually much safer as well. So I hear you for sure. And we can definitely take a look at that at a specific location if you'd like, but we're seeing the benefits outweigh some of those initial training concerns.
Got it. Thank you. Well, I think given the time frame, I think wraps it up. I just wanted to let everyone know that the report will be available for download on the Blue Collar Survey website later this afternoon. So appreciate all of you that have already proactively gone on there and have tried to download the report. It will be available this afternoon. So we appreciate your patience as we get it loaded up there. Also, there have been a lot of comments and questions about sharing the chat in the webinar. A lot of you have been networking and providing information. So we'll look into that and find ways to get that information to you. But some great ideas there. So again, we thank you so much for your engagement and appreciate you all.
Yep. Have a great week, guys. Thanks so much.